Greetings and salutations, people of the internet. Austin here. I want to thank y'all for helping me reach 300 subs on this channel. I couldn't have done this without y'all. As I hinted at in the last video where I covered the Mega Evolutions, this is going to be the last video of 2024, as I'm taking December off to work on January's video, and honestly, I just kind of need a break. So, I thought it would be fun to go back and roast the first ever fakemon region I did. The original version of the Sydine Region. Originally back then, I wasn't even planning on making full fakemon regions. I only did a few here and there on a whim. But after seeing Jack's videos on the Maza region and some other incredible regions I was following, I had to throw my hat into the ring. Strap in, people. The quality of these early Pokemon are rough. But it will be good to show how far I've come. First, beginning in October 2021, let's roast the ever-loving hell out of the original Sydine region. Before we get into that, though, let's get something out of the way first. There is no rhyme or reason with the dex placements of the Pokemon here. I drew Pokemon based on what types I hadn't drawn in a while. I also won't be going into their basis since I already did that in the reboot version, so go check that out if you want more information on some of these Pokemon. Lastly, I won't be going over my in-game team since most of the Sydine reboot is more or less my in-game team with the exception of a few, and I just don't want to try and figure out with this region. It hurts looking at these mons enough. All that said, let's get to roasting. Jabby, the boxing Pokemon. Oh my god, everything about this sucks. You'll hear me repeat a variation of this with almost every fakemon in this region, and I'll mean it every time. The shading is the worst thing about this design, outside of the generally shitty proportions. It took me a while to shift over to a less awful rendering style in this region. Melee Supial, a strong cross Pokemon. The awful render aside, this isn't actually that bad for a middle stage. Though the log helmet / training gear does look awful on a second glance. Yeesh. Of the original trio, this is the best middle stage by a wide margin. It still sucks, but I'm not as embarrassed to look at it nowadays. Champeroo, the heavyweight Pokemon. The second least awful final starter of the OG region. This isn't the worst thing I've done in this region, but it's still far from good. The legs are a mess, the bark boxing gloves and title belt are too flat, and the wrapping around the tail just looks awful. The pupils needed to be bigger, and the arm perspective / scale is way off, now that I'm really paying attention to it. The shade of yellow on the shiny is nauseating. Ugh. Dingry, the insatiable Pokemon. This is the best starter of the OG trio, and it's not even close. That said, the back legs are too long, the head to stomach ratio is off, and the eyes look terrible. But overall, it's still the most successful in what I wanted to convey. I did this region out of order, so that's why the rendering isn't as bad with the Jabby line. I had started using something closer to the Sugimori style. It still wasn't good, mind you, but it was a start. Suspark, the Picky Eater Pokemon. The biggest issue with this design is that it's too tall for a middle stage overall. The basic design works, even if the face is terrible, but it's the proportions that what kill this Pokemon. I really hate how the tails across the board look with this line. None of them look good. This also needed more of an actual neck to help break up the body and the overall silhouette. Still, at least the personality and pose come through despite the technical hiccups. Chef Flame, the cook Pokemon. Give the design thicker legs, and it wouldn't be that bad, honestly. Some of the colors needed to be shifted around for some color balancing, but this is a design that makes me want to vomit when I look at it. Some of the proportions also need a change, mainly with the paws, I feel. I also don't like the eye shape here. They're almost there, but not quite. So Plato, the opera Pokemon. The worst starter of the three. It is not even close. The proportions are awful. The render is somehow worse than Jabby. No, that one's debatable. I'll give you that much. And the damn tail just looks like trash. The head-to-body ratio isn't that scuffed. It's abysmal. I am going to need to break out a thesaurus to find more synonyms for the word awful so this doesn't get stale. Thankfully, the pose and the overall idea isn't that bad with this Pokemon. Altipus, the performer Pokemon. The colors are too muted, the tail is boring, the proportions are whack, and overall, I want to strangle my past self. Easily the worst starter, middle stage. Get this off my screen. Platypus, the stage Pokemon. Why did I do this to myself? Okay, speed run. The cape is horrible, you can't even tell that it's supposed to be seaweed. The colors are bland, and there is no sense of depth with the tail. It's flatter than a washboard. The proportions are uninteresting, the render looks terrible, and the overall color balance is ass. Worst final starter of the OG trio. Thank God the reboot fixed these train wrecks. Wombaby, the thick hide Pokemon. Not going to sugarcoat this at all, this might be the worst design of the entire region. I despise everything about this Pokemon. The head-to-body ratio is off, the legs are too skinny, and their placement needed major revisions. The eyes are too small, and the face is just overall too close together. The reboot didn't make me love this mon, but it went from trash to mid at the very least. Womboulder, the rock rump Pokemon. Everything I said about the last entry applies here, but with even more problems. The colors are bland, especially the fur when put up against the rock on its body. The scale of the legs don't work at all. Way too skinny for this build, especially with this angle. Ugh. The spot pattern doesn't work, it only clutters the design needlessly, and overall, I still don't like this Pokemon, original or reboot. It doesn't matter. Kookablur, the echoing laugh Pokemon. This one isn't that bad, honestly. The biggest issue are that the perspective is kind of wonky, the angle just not working at all in my opinion, and the proportions being slightly off across the board. The colors are also a tad too bland, so I changed that in the reboot for the better. I'm at least not ashamed of this one. Axelidae, the Flash Fisher Pokemon. Outside of the color scheme being a tad jarring, and the silhouette being too uniform without any major deviation shape-wise, this isn't terrible. Outside of the tail feathers, that is. Those are just bad. The feet are also too skinny, and the pupil is too small for the face. All things considered, I had an easy time fixing this years later. Termini, the woodcutter Pokemon. Oh boy, this line. Suffice to say, this is the worst overall line of the original region. At least right now it is. I could change my mind once I get further down and I forget how much I hated another one. Where do I even begin with how much of a failure this design is? The profile view does the design no favors, the legs are awful, the color scheme is boring, and the line work is particularly horrid here. Not gonna touch on that one too much since most of the line work in this region sucks. Thankfully, I managed to salvage this line in the reboot. Termite, the Shredder Pokemon. The worst design of the original line. This is a failure on every single level. It commits the worst crime. It doesn't even remotely look like a Pokemon. The proportions are terrible, way too big for a middle stage. The head shape is gross and not in a good way. The legs are a failure, and the shiny is just underwhelming. Just move on to the next design. Her Majesty Female, the Royal Mound Pokemon. These next two aren't terrible, but more so disappointing. I do like the shape of the throne here. I think it gets the termite mound vibe down well enough, but the lack of color variation and texture do hurt it a lot, making it just kind of bland here. The design of the queen herself is okay at best. She has no real variation in her proportions, so she feels a bit stagnant, something I made sure to fix in the reboot. Of the two gender variations, this is the better design. Her Majesty Male, the Floating Throne Pokemon. Everything I said about the female version applies to this one more or less, the only major difference being in their thrones. I do like the floating throne since this one is part psychic type, so I think that helps convey it moderately well. The final stages prevent this line from being complete trash, but they're still overall not good. Tasmaniac, the Insane Pokemon. This one isn't awful, all things considered, only minor things holding it back. The legs are a bit too long, and the fur on the back needed to be simplified a smidgen. There's also a bit too many colors, and the head-to-body ratio is slightly off. Still, far from the worst of this region. Luna Tiger, the Madness Pokemon. This one turned out too human in the end, proportion and face-wise for my liking. The Ectoplasm Straitjacket was a fun idea that just didn't work in practice, sadly. The legs are also way off and looked unbalanced as a result. The shiny is a travesty that I will never live down. I am so sorry, y'all have to see this. I also fucked up the spelling of the name here, and I had to correct that in the reboot. I was, and continue to be, made of stupid. Hokaira Neko, the Stockpile Pokemon. This one was actually more or less perfect. The only thing, besides the terrible line work, are that the limbs are too small for the body. A cleaner separation between the underbelly and the rest of the body wouldn't have hurt, but it wasn't a deal breaker back then. Probably the most successful Pokemon from the OG region thus far. Minor, the Collection Pokemon. Another design that actually didn't need too many changes back then to be great. Only really needing to smooth out a lot of the edges and adding highlights to the pupil, and this Pokemon's still pretty good. Golden, the Sifter Pokemon. This one needed a bit more changes comparatively, mainly in the color department. The colored ones don't have enough contrast, so it feels very flat as a result. Like the previous stage, smoothing out a lot of the edges would have done this Pokemon a whole lot of good. The Sifter arms needed more depth to them, but they weren't the worst thing about this design, so I won't harp on them too much. Repector, the Horde Pokemon. This one probably needed the most work out of all of them, but not to the extent of some of the other previous failures. I needed to make the gold more uniform throughout the body instead of the random placement like in the middle stage. The backpack of gold needed more of a silhouette to it, and the pickaxe hands are too flat. So they definitely needed a little bit more definition. Not bad, but not great. Smorier, the Marshmallow Pokemon. Alright, this little cutie's issues are easy to spot and were easy to fix in the reboot. The chocolate helmet needed to be more uniform and less busy, and the legs needed to line up with the rest of the body better. The arms are also a tad on the small size, but all in all, I would call it a success that just needed another pass to be good. Smite, the S'more Pokemon. All the issues with Smorier apply here and then some, so I won't repeat them again. Pokemon is too skinny for this type of design. I needed to make the torso bigger and simplify the shield a bit so it wasn't so busy against the rest of the body. Lastly, I should have shown off more of the flaming marshmallow on top of their spear. The flame on their head is also pathetic. I really should have made that bitch a little bit bigger. Crow, the mobster Pokemon. Fun fact with this one. This was originally a split evolution for Murkrow when it was holding a King's Rock. I corrected this mistake and made it a proper evolution for Honchkrow in the reboot. Anyway, this design is overall solid, but it's not great. The hat feels too tacked on with the current design, the face feels off with the visible wrinkles, the tail is weak, and the overall silhouette is just lackluster. Colors needed a bit more variation, I will say. Though, I do wish I kept the mustache after looking at the beta Honchkrow design that got leaked a few weeks ago. I'm kicking myself for that one. Hazfly, the breach containment Pokemon. The head is way too big for the body here. I should have shrunk that down considerably. The render on the poisonous gas could have been done better, but it's not awful. Comparatively, anyway. I don't like the wings here, mainly thanks to the render, so I changed them up in the reboot to look more like other bug types. The arms and legs are also on the small size, so I needed to size them up the second time around. All in all, I didn't have to change much, so this Pokemon can't be that bad. English, the deep sea Pokemon. This was originally supposed to be the early regional fish of the Sydine region before that honor was given to Aquamunda in the reboot. These were some of the first mons I made in general. I don't even think I named the region yet. So yeah, deep sea Pokemon in the early routes does make a whole lot of sense. I probably just threw them up front since I needed water types more than likely. As for the design, the proportions are all off. The fins are too small, the body shape doesn't flow well, and the jaw doesn't go far enough on the body for the vibe I wanted. The torso was also barren, so I added some patterns on the side on the redesign. As underwhelming as this is, the evolution is worse. Anglure, the bait Pokemon. Oh hell, where do I even begin with this one? Everything outside of the idea with this Pokemon fails on every level. This is the ugliest Pokemon I have ever made, and I will be hard-pressed to ever make one worse. The proportions make no sense, there is no flow with the body, the fins are too small, as are the tiny quills across the body, and there isn't enough color variation in the palette. The shiny is also utter dog water. I am ashamed of this design, and are ever thankful I turned around in the redesign years later. Geckoline, the flammable spray Pokemon. This one isn't actually that bad. I'd call it good overall, honestly. The only major issues I had to change with this Pokemon were shrinking the legs and simplifying the flame pattern on the back and tail so it wasn't as busy. Oh, I also removed the small pattern on the body. It was also cluttering more than it was helping. Good job, past me. This one actually isn't that bad. Sydine Paris, the mushroom Pokemon. This one wasn't too far off from being a good design, only a few minor issues holding it back. The color palette is the main thing holding it back here. They're too muted and the overall balance is off. I added the colored leg tips to help fix that in the redesign. The arms are also a tad too small in the initial design here, so they needed to get buffed up. A solid regional variant. Sydine Parasect, the mushroom Pokemon. More or less the same issues plaguing Paris are present here. The colors needed an update and readjusted to better flow as a whole. The shape of the mushroom caps are also just a touch off. Too squashed down for my liking, so I have to puff them up in the second pass later on. I still really do love the shinies with this line. Turhelm, the helmet shell Pokemon. This tiny fella's actually pretty successful, only needing one more pass to iron out the little details. pattern on the back needed tweaking, the eye is too small, and the overall color palette didn't have enough contrast to it. Aside from those issues, this Pokemon is actually damn solid in my eyes. Torspike, the Spike Shell Pokemon. Like its Prevo, this design really just needed one more pass to fix the little flaws holding it back. The spikes on the back are slightly too big, and the claws on the feet are slightly too small. The colors are also a bit too muted, but as it is, this isn't bad. Actually, one of the better designs from the OG region. Tundra, the Third Eye Pokemon. Okay, I've been a bit too positive with the last few entries. Let's go back to pointing out my past flaws. The proportions are absolutely boring, way too close to the actual animal. The color palette is utterly dull. The leg positioning in the back makes no damn sense. And outside of the third eye and the ice spikes on the back, this looks more like an ordinary lizard than a Pokemon. Thankfully, the reboot fixed this travesty big time. Pathefus, the Breaking and Entering Pokemon. Continuing the negativity train, this is a near-complete failure outside of the concept. The head is too big, the arms and legs are too long, the tail looks like shit and is just too damn skinny in general. Thankfully, the concept was good, otherwise I might have scrapped this little bastard in the reboot. Ugh, I can't believe I thought this was good. Napbat, the Drowsy Pokemon. This eepy little cutie isn't that bad. Only the feet and the color contrast being the things holding the design back. I needed to spread the feet out more to give it some semblance of balance, and I needed to make the onesie darker to contrast the rest of the fur. The wings also needed to go further into the torso since it looks awkward as it is currently. It's just a solid little man's. Comatosa, the Hibernating Pokemon. Too much ice was the major thing preventing this Pokemon from being awesome from jump. Way too much of it dripping off the body. Or I guess hanging off the body is the better terminology. Also, outside the wing colors being a tad boring, this is a solid design that didn't need to change all too much. Chiloptera, the Well-Rested Pokemon. Oh boy, this design is sadly the weak link of the line by a country mile. The ice swings just don't work at all like I wanted them to, which is so damn disappointing. The colors are too close in hue and don't have enough contrast. The legs are just kind of meh all around. Worst of all, that shiny is a crime against nature. I had my work cut out for me in the reboot with this one. Melavenom, the Thick Hide Pokemon. The biggest thing I needed to change with this one are the colors. Mainly the red. They are way too muted in this design. The eyes also kind of bug me looking at it, so I changed them to the solid red in the reboot with the black pupil just to feel more feral. The stingers lodged in the body needed a touch-up, and the legs are a touch off base here. But overall, this was solid. I might be giving this Pokemon some love in an upcoming region of mine that I haven't done yet. Stay tuned to the channel for more. Dullfilter, the Purifier Pokemon. The colors are too muted, the pattern on the fins are too complicated, and I needed to separate the colors with line work since there's not enough contrast for that to work here as it is currently. The dome is also too small for my liking, so I had to widen that out in the reboot. Made the colors darker there as well. The base design is overall solid, so I didn't have to change much, but I'm still annoyed that I didn't do better the first time around. Sydine Helioptile, the Generator Pokemon. This one actually didn't need to change too much looking back and forth between the two versions. It was actually pretty good out the gate. I just needed to simplify the pattern on the ear and to lighten the shade of orange and black of the color scheme. Well, that and have a better render, but that goes without saying for the entire region. Sydine Heliolisk, the Generator Pokemon. Second verse, same as the first, more or less. Biggest change was altering the base skin tone to something lighter, so the frills in the black sections had more contrast and weight to them. Oh, I forgot to mention the original shinies for these two are very underwhelming, so I had to change them in the reboot. Heliosar, the laser array Pokemon. Okay, this one needed more changes than the other ones in the line by a good amount. I needed to bring down the overall intensity of the crimson for the main body, simplifying both the frill and the overall color scheme. The pose needed a rework since it just didn't work all that well. It didn't feel dinosaur-y enough, so I had to change that. The eye being bright red blends in too much with the eyebrow / pattern, so that needed to change to something more easily visible. This was a solid idea that was way too busy for its own good. Something that'll be a common complaint this entire version of the region. Yay. Magdai, the Eternal Vengeance Pokemon. Ugh, this one hurts to look at. The legs are the biggest miss in this design. They look awful, and it just makes no damn sense. The face pattern is a bit too on the nose, and it looks awkward in this position, and the wings are a touch too big for the body. The overall proportions are out of whack, but not by a terrible amount. Ugh. Typanic, the Skittish Serpent Pokemon. This one didn't need a lot of changes looking back, mainly just needing more contrast with the head and tail, a brighter purple, and a bigger, more expressive eye. Oh, the shovel tail needed to be a bit wider. Otherwise, the design's actually pretty good. Shockbian, the Taser Claw Pokemon. Oh, I forgot how bad this one initially was. Great. Alright, let's speed run this one. The head shape and face suck. They don't look good on this body type. The proportions are off. The torso is too long, and the tail is too thin. The legs and the tail segments look like crap, and the taser claw positioning is just boring, even if they are still the most interesting part of the design. This benefited so much from the redesign and the reboot you don't even know. Scoreshock, the Lightning Claw Pokemon. Unlike its Prevo, this was actually pretty solid, outside of the awful tail segments and the render on the electric claws and stinger. The legs are a touch too small, and the pincers needed more of an actual shape to them to create a more interesting silhouette. Thankfully, this didn't need to change a whole lot in the reboot, only streamline what was already there. Lesuran, the Sprinting Pokemon. Proportions are the thing holding this design back more than anything else. The legs are too long for this design, and it's entirely too skinny. The tail is also a touch too long, so that needed to be shrunk down a little bit. Solid design that didn't need too much work. Moving on. Dracolite, the Triathlon Pokemon. Okay, so let's get the most embarrassing fumble out of the way first. On the back leg, I put the tiny claw on the wrong side of the foot because I was too busy focusing on getting the pose down, so I essentially copied the front-facing foot. Now that that's out of the way, this design is entirely too busy. The stripes and the claw tips bogged down the design with too many details, so they had to get booted in the reboot. I needed to make this Pokemon more balanced proportion-wise, so I added the fin on the tail for stability, and color balancing in general in the reboot since it didn't have it otherwise. This version, you see right here, is entirely too human for its own good. Papsicle, the Frozen Mint Pokemon. This one is such a disappointment in every single way. This doesn't look like a Pokemon, it looks like a cheap food mascot. The line work is particularly ass. The sense of perspective and depth are non-existent, and the greens of the design are too close together in hue, so they almost blend into one another. The arms are just awful. There was no salvaging them. I had to lock in with the redesign for this Mon. Only the general, broad strokes of the design made it into the redesign. Oh my god, this sucks. Sandinian Ice-Cube, the Penguin Pokemon. The base form of this Pokemon ain't bad at all, honestly, only needing a few touch-ups in the color palette and making the torso slightly thicker. The render on the water bubble is trash, however. There is no other way to say it. There was no saving that train wreck. Oh, and the original shinies here are so damn boring. I scrapped those entirely in the second draft of this design, but the base form I still like. Anyway, Psycuddle, the Mindbender Pokemon. This one isn't too bad. Only a few proportions needing to be fixed. The head is at the wrong angle and needed to be slightly taller, and these smaller tentacles here are a bit too long, so those needed to be shrunk down. I massively simplified the swirl pattern on the head so it's more consistent in shape and width, seeing as how that was the worst part of the original design. Overall, this was solid, so it didn't need to change too much. The Evolution, on the other hand, Neurocto, the Synapse Pokemon. This sucks. No beating around the bush. Outside of the basic idea, the execution of this design fails on every single level. The proportions are awful, the pattern is way too cluttered, the head looks like shit. This needed a damn near complete redesign in the reboot. Oh my god, it was so needed. I am so angry at my past self for thinking this was even remotely acceptable. Shell on Ice, the Glacier Shell Pokemon. Another example of good idea, meh execution. The design's main issue is that it's overcomplicated with the ice detailing on the shell. The render on that is just terrible. I can't even try to defend it. I needed to massively cut back on the amount of ice on the design, so there was more contrast with the actual body. As it stands, meh. Fungost, the Ectoshroom Pokemon. This Pokemon was almost good the first time around, but the proportions killed that possibility. The legs are way too long and spread out for this small of a Pokemon, and the mushroom cap is too small, as well as janky with the line work. It also doesn't help it doesn't have enough color variation, which is why I added the white in the rebooted design. As underwhelming as this is, the evolution is straight up trash. Ghost Shroom, the Toxic Spectre Pokemon. This Timu Trevenant is one of the worst designs of the entire region, and it's not even close. I hate everything about this design outside of the colors. I actually think the palette's pretty good overall, which is why I kept that in the rebooted design. The mushroom caps are once again too janky and small, the proportions are just awful. The long legs do it no favors, and what was I even thinking with those hands? I had to completely redesign this guy from the ground up, because god did it need it. Revfin, the Motorblade Pokemon. The pose was the first big mistake of this design. The perspective of the fin doesn't work in the slightest, and this Pokemon doesn't have the right proportions to actually feel like a Pokemon in my eyes. The chainsaw nose just doesn't look good here. It needed more stylization, not to just be like a chainsaw grafted onto a fish. Solid idea, poor execution. Story of this region in a nutshell. Sydine Seal, the sea lion Pokemon. This was one pass away from being good. Thankfully, there were only minor issues holding this guy back. The tail fin is too divided. I needed to make it more of a unified shape while still giving it the depth it needed. The ears don't work. Those needed to go. I needed to keep the back fur and the rest of the body more distinct shape-wise, so the main body needed to be smoother so the fur stood out more. The horn needed to be a bit more rigid. Not terrible, but not hitting its potential. Sydine Dugong, the sea lion Pokemon. This looks terrible, but the actual needed fixes are minor. The spot pattern needs to be more uniform placement-wise as opposed to being all over the place here. Ditch the ears, swap out the dark brown of the fins and neck fur for a darker blue. Give it some whiskers, and the face needed another pass in general, but that was easy to fix. Still turned out better than the regional evolution. Sealephant, the elephant seal Pokemon. This has two main issues, and they're big ones. Number one, this thing is fucking ugly and not in a good way. This is just unpleasant to look at. Two, it doesn't resemble the rest of the line at all, and that is a huge knock against the design. The nose needed to be blockier, the colors needed to be completely reworked. It needed a horn to keep that through line of the design going. The proportions and pose just don't work here, and the overall design sucks. This is the worst regional evolution in the original region here by a country mile. Spectroderma, the Phantom Wing Pokemon. The ugliest Pokemon of the region goes to Spectroderma. My God, this is trash. Everything about this design doesn't work in the slightest. The more realistic bone wings don't look good, even if the ectoplasm membrane is alright. It looks even worse with the ears. The face is the worst part of the design. Nothing looks good whatsoever, with only the feet being close behind. This also needed a redesign so badly. Mandalore, the tree cutter Pokemon. Fun fact, this is originally a straight up evolution for Pinsir before I changed it to a regional evolution in the reboot alongside adding Sydine and Pinsir. So whereas I worked off of the beta design for the scrapped Pinsir evolution for the rebooted design, this one had none of that and was essentially just bigger Pinsir. The only thing I kept from this design and the reboot was the general pose and proportions alongside the general horns. Everything else was rightfully scrapped since this is a terrible evolution. Meme design aside, the Dunsparce is much better than this. Vineritis, the false vine Pokemon. This design wasn't bad, but it needed tweaks big time. I needed to change the head completely in the reboot since this one's just kind of boring, and I needed to massively shrink the body. Granted, in the original here, this is only a 2-stage line, so this is less egregious if it had been a 3-stage line from the start. Still too long though, I'll keep that going. Branthon, the branch serpent Pokemon. If I had kept this line as 2 stages, this design would have been perfectly fine. The only major issues of the design here are the colors being a tad muted and the lack of a clear texture on the body, mainly in the bark sections. Otherwise, this design is actually perfectly serviceable. Sendinian Diglett, the Tombstone Pokemon. The most successful and popular designs from this original region. Yeah, originally these two were regional variants prior to Scarlet and Violet introducing convergent Pokemon. The only thing I needed to change about the design here was to simplify the minor details, mainly removing them. The eyes aren't great on a second look, so that also needed to change. Sendinian Dugtrio, the Tombstone Pokemon. Second verse, same as the first. Everything I said about the preview applies here as well. The vine was definitely a mess here. That needed to change above anything else going into a redesign. The eye color here also doesn't stand out enough, which is why I changed it to red in the reboot. Otherwise, I still think these Pokemon are goated. Yarambush, the Vampire Grip Pokemon. One of the many prime examples of over-designing a Pokemon. Strap in, this is going to be a long rant. The patterning is entirely too intricate. I had to cut the majority of it for the reboot. The proportions suck, this Pokemon is too tall, the head needed to be wider, and the legs needed to be lower in a squat, more or less. The throat sac needed to be bigger and combined with the stomach area to create a cleaner silhouette. The fingers are too long, and they just don't feel natural. This required so much work to fix. Charreeper, the Soul Shark Pokemon. Oh boy, this one. Since this was pre-Scarlet and Violet, thusly, no Palafin, the chillin' villain gimmick naturally wasn't a part of the thought process here in the original version. The fins needed to be more streamlined. They're too damn wavy and they look terrible as a result. The body's also too long, needed to shrink the tail and the torso dramatically. Lastly, the teeth and pupils blend in with the body colors too much, and they needed to be their own separate color to stand out more. Herdog, the Rancher Pokemon. This goodish boy's biggest issues are the proportions and pose not doing this Pokemon any favors, making it look more like a regular dog than a Pokemon. The head-to-body ratio is off, the head is way too small for a first stage and needs to be buffed up a tad. The tail is also too small and skinny for my tastes. It should have been a lot floofier for the cute factor. This is okay at best. Chipbark, the Rancher Pokemon. This just sucks. I despise everything about this design. The rocks look absolutely awful. One of the many reasons I made it a normal ground type in the reboot. The colors are just terrible. They're too dark and they don't provide enough contrast. Ugh, I never want to look at this abomination again. We're moving on. Chronocross, the punctual Pokemon. Oh god, it's not any better. This is not a Pokemon. This is a discount Mega Man enemy. The eyes are the biggest knock against the design. They don't work at all and contribute the most to this not looking like a Pokemon. I don't care for the hands here, which is why I switched them to boxing gloves in the redesign. Most of the design is actually okay, but it definitely needed a reboot to just scrap the majority of the things holding it back. Blech. Pathorda, the Thorn Trap Pokemon. The overall design of this Pokemon is solid, but a few big issues are holding this little fella back. The head position doesn't work here, the expression doesn't look great, and the perspective of it is just meh. The feet are way too big, as well as the tail for that matter. The head-to-body ratio is off a tad, with the head being a little too small. I also needed to make the colors more streamlined, mainly in the tail. Molathorn, the Spike Fortress Pokemon. The only thing I changed with this design in the reboot is making the spikes slightly more uniform in shape. Otherwise, I knocked this design out of the park the first time around. No notes. Aqualock, the Siphon Skin Pokemon. This one, on the other hand, isn't as good, sadly. The legs and tail are rough here. I needed to simplify the tail shape to make it more streamlined, as well as the legs. The colors aren't varied enough contrast-wise, mainly with the sand color here. The water bubbles on the spikes are also way too small. They needed to be buffed up since they don't stand out enough. The rest of the design is more or less solid. Sydine Meowth, the Feral Cat Pokemon. The scars are the biggest issue here. And even then, it's not awful. I just needed to simplify the scars on the body so it wasn't as busy, mainly in the chest and face. Otherwise, no notes. I need to do more regional Meowths. They're fun. It's been a long-ass time since I've done one. Sydinian Persian, the Feral Cat Pokemon. Same criticisms here apply for Meowth, only amplified. I also needed to darken the fur color and the scars overall so the palette was a bit more varied. Honestly, this is a good regional variant, only bogged down by excess. Arachnida, the Tailless Scorpion Pokemon. This Pokemon is entirely too busy outline and texture-wise to be successful. I really needed to simplify the rock texture across the body and smooth out the segments as a whole so they are easier to read at a glance. The head and eyes are also too small in general. I don't love this design in the original or reboot, but moving on. Diamondid, the Diamond Scorpion Pokemon. The color balancing of this Pokemon just sucks. The entire design being that dark gray against the light blue of the diamonds just doesn't work. I should have brought over the dark blue to provide more contrast with the segments, which is why I did that in the reboot. The crystals are way too jagged to look like a Pokemon, mainly in the arms. Oh god, this took so long to fix in the second pass, you have no idea. Sandinian Sableye, the Gambler Pokemon. The perspective on the die size are the only major issues with this design, and I needed to outline the yellow of the hands and feet so they didn't blend in as much. Oh, I also needed to add the spikes on the elbow, like I did in the rebooted version, to break out the silhouette, since that's kind of one minor issue this has. Otherwise, I nailed this design. If you couldn't tell, I really like Sableye. Dizzy, the Dizzy Pokemon. The basic design here works, but my god, the execution is sloppier than pig shit. The eyes, hands, and feet look like garbage. The antennae are a hot mess. The limbs are a smidge too skinny, and the sense of balance with this pose just isn't there. Ironically, well enough. It was almost there, it just needed one more pass to iron out the massive kinks. Decap Planeta, the spectral head Pokemon. Oh boy, this one. Outside of the skull mark on the back and the general idea, this design sucks. The limbs are a hodgepodge of different fuck-ups. The feet positioning make no sense, the legs are too skinny, and the overall design is just boring outside of the ectoplasmic head. The sheer difference between this and the redesign in quality is staggering. Sydine Dunsparce, the sea snake Pokemon. Another regional variant I turned into a convergent the second time around in the reboot. The design was actually pretty solid overall, but a few tweaks were needed, mainly with the tail. The tail shape is all wrong for something called the sea snake Pokemon, and having a fishtail? Not my best idea there. The colors are also a tad on the boring side. I needed more variety there. Oh, and the whiskers were too small. Otherwise, I still really like the design. Dunviathan, the deep sea Pokemon. Yeah, before the Dunsparce, this was Dunviathan. I repurposed the name for the Prevo when I turned them into Convergence. This isn't a terrible evolution, but it's kind of boring. The pose isn't interesting, the colors are only marginally better, and it doesn't add enough new elements to the design to be fun. This could have been worse, but I am so much happier with the Dunviathan in the reboot compared to this one. Staticea, the Hidden Volt Pokemon. Much like the Diamondid line, the main issue holding this Pokemon back is the over-detailing of the rock texture and the lack of color contrast. I needed to vastly scale back this design so it was actually readable at a glance instead of this. I definitely needed to make the brown and gray more distinctive since they kind of blend into each other too much here. The tail fin and spines also needed a touch-up, simplifying them a touch here and there. Overall though, I think I nailed the overall package of the design. Take a shot every time I say the word overall when I ramble. Vitrax, the Pursuit Pokemon. Fun fact probably mentioned in the reboot video, but for those who haven't watched that one, these two were the first fakemon I ever drew, and oh god, they look terrible! The head is too small, this thing is just too fat, and the legs are fucking twigs. But the overall base design works, so I decided to just update what was already there, and not really add anything that second time around. I've come a long way since these guys. Atrasiper, the Relentless Pokemon. The design isn't actually all that bad, but I don't feel like it's particularly interesting either. So on the reboot, I gave it a new body plan, a much bigger thorax, and I messed around with the colors more, mainly removing the yellow and replacing it with gray. The yellow doesn't work on this design as well as it did with the Prevo. It's not a bad first Fakemon ever, but it's far from my best, as it should be. Shadonka, the Phantom Cat Pokemon. Another ghost that's almost perfect the first time around, but is held back by a few things. The bluish-green eyes and inner ear don't work. There's not enough contrast, which is why I replaced it with red in the reboot. Secondly, I needed to simplify the ectoplasmic sections of the body with the head and tail, smoothing them out shape-wise and adjusting the overall proportions of the body to better reflect that. The pose isn't terrible, but I don't think the raised claw works with this design. Sandinian Oranguru, the Sage Pokemon. These two you might remember a touch differently in the rebooted Sydine Region. I turned them into evolutions opposed to regional variants there, as they originally were in this one. This and the Legendaries of the region are the main examples I use when I say shit was overcomplicated in this region. Dear Arceus, there is too much going on. Too many details, too many damn colors, and what the hell was that poor excuse for a didgeridoo? Oh my god, this hurts to look at. Move on. Sandinian Passimian, the Teamwork Pokemon. Unlike its counterpart, There isn't actually much wrong with this design as a regional variant. My biggest issues is that the helmet looks off on this, the strap being kind of unnecessary. The knuckles are too small and get hidden by the rest of the design, and the tail is too small to make use of the face for an intimidation tactic. This is a solid regional variant, but I think it makes for an even better evolution. Bratite, the Steel Beak Pokemon. Oh, this fucking little shit looks so bad! The legs. The legs. What was I thinking? They're too damn small for that dump truck of a body. The pattern looks like shit and nothing looks good here. Only saving grace that the design is super simple, so it was easy to fix it in the redesign that it's so desperately needed. Caststrike, the Steel Claw Pokemon. This is only marginally less awful in comparison to Bratite, but not by much. The renders on the feathers is trash. The legs are still too skinny for this Pokemon, and there's not nearly enough color in the overall palette. It is so dull, it hurts in that regard. This needed a complete overhaul in the reboot. Moving on. Avelier, the Imposter Pokemon. The pose was the best thing about this design, but even then it wasn't good enough to keep in the redesign. The legs are awful looking twigs that have no sense of balance. The beak has no depth to it from this perspective. The color palette is ass, no contrast whatsoever, and the proportions are too safe. There is nothing to draw in the eye. I had a lot of work to do with this one when I came to redesigning it. Pyron, the Internal Combustion Pokemon. Honestly, outside making the tail more 3D and some minor color balancing with the red, this design is kinda perfect even in this draft. The idea came through exactly how I wanted it to, and I wouldn't change it any more than the minor tweaks I did in the reboot. This is one of the few goated designs I will stand by. Sydine Bergmite, the Rock Chunk Pokemon. The last regional turned convergent of the OG region to the reboot. There isn't anything exactly wrong with this design, outside of the rocks being too jagged and over-detailed. Only reason I changed the design in the reboot is that I needed to make more distinctions as a convergent versus that of a regional form. The shade of blue around the eyes is also a little bit too faded. I needed to make them more saturated to stand out more. Sydine Avalugg, the Plateau Pokemon. Once again, too much detailing is muddying an overall very good design. Shading was decent, overall good silhouette. Only major thing I'd change with this specific design is make the purple stand out more visually as the focal point of the design. If I hadn't turned this line into a convergent species, I would have happily kept this design as is, more or less. Hindite, the Matchstick Pokemon. Outside of the render on the fire being complete balls, this isn't too bad of a design. Only a few modifications were really needed to fix this Pokemon. The head-to-body ratio is slightly off, the wing is too far back on the body and needed to be bigger, and the feet needed to be slightly further apart. A few tweaks here and there, and this little Pyro actually would have been pretty perfect the first time around. Pyraptor, the Arson Pokemon. This one, on the other hand, needed a lot more work to be classified as good. Immediately, the torch had to be moved to the foots, so it had more freedom of movement and looked less stupid overall. The smoke cloud plumage needed to be bigger. The legs are too long, and I needed to minimize the yellow on this stage, so it was more of a jump on the final evolution. The shiny also sucked. That had to be fixed ASAP. Napok, the Bushfire Pokemon. The gradients on the wings and tail don't work out nearly as much as I would have liked to. I had to scrap that and section them off properly. The head also blends in too much with the neck, and needing more of a separation there. The body was also a touch too dark, so I had to lighten that shade of black by a few notches so the design read easier. The render on the burning bush slash bomb was also buns. That needed more time in the design oven for sure. Overall, a good design that was really held back by my lack of experience more than anything else. Poisinda, the Toxic Quill Pokemon. There are entirely too many spikes on the back here. Needed to cut that crap down immensely. Claws on the feet are too big, and the overall legs are a touch too long. Not by much, though. The colors don't have enough variation and contrast. The metal on the head and back needing to be darkened a tad more to stand out. The marking on the eye also doesn't work with the tear, so I had to make that the eyelid in the reboot. This is a solid, sad little man. Sydine Komala, the drowsing Pokemon. There isn't much wrong with this design as it stands here, but it too is a victim of excess. There is too much moss on the body. I should have trimmed that down by at least 40% or so, give or take. I also needed to simplify the textures on said moss. The branch on the stump it's holding on to needed to be smoothed out to create a more pleasing silhouette. And the eye placement is just off enough here to make it look uncanny, so that had to change. Komal, the restful guardian Pokemon. I like the idea of this pose, but the execution doesn't work nearly as well as I would have liked. Like Komala, too many details on the moss and tree, so the design is cluttered visually. The moss blanket and neck frill look odd, mainly thanks to the lackluster shading there. I made it a grass dark type in the reboot to reference drop bears a bit more, and as an excuse to give it a more dynamic color palette. Paranid, the web shoot Pokemon. This design is actually more or less perfect in my eyes, only a lack of experience holding it back. The colors are too muted for this design, needed to make them a bit more lively. The eyes are too small and the straps/pedipalps are too long, not by much thankfully. The body is slightly too big, and lastly there are too many details on the web parachute. Otherwise though, I still really love this Pokemon. Skyder, the electric current Pokemon. This one is a bit more of a mess in comparison to Paranid, but the changes needed were easy, so I won't slam this design too much. The legs are the biggest flaw here. The segmentation looks awful, and the feet don't work for this design, making it look less aerodynamic. The web needed to go further into the body, looking like it was attached like an actual membrane so it could glide easier. I don't care for the mouth here, so I changed it to something simpler in the reboot. Lastly, some minor color correction is needed here and there, mainly with the torso area. Still a solid overall design. If I had $1 every time I said the word overall, I could afford not to make these videos. Or who am I kidding? I don't have monetization yet. What am I rambling about? Illuminmin, the Spectral Lights Pokemon. The fixes necessary for this Pokemon to be good were minor, but vital, at least in hindsight. The body needed to be more compact. The sections jutting out of the side needed to be smaller, but thicker. The aura needed to be simplified with more evident colored outlines. The tips of the sections jutting out needed to be the same color as the face to create a more cohesive color palette. Lastly, some minor variations in their expressions was needed, if just to make each one a little bit more unique. Pretty good Pokemon, just held back by my overall incompetency back then. Yaochi, the elusive Pokemon. The head is way too big for this little guy. This bobblehead looking ass needing some proportion changes ASAP. The ears are also a touch too long. The number of bandages needed to be cut down. Lastly, the leg placement needed to change since there's no real sense of balance in the pose as it is currently. Some minor color correction would have helped as well. Yalrath, the elusive Pokemon. This didn't need as many changes, thankfully. Mainly just shrinking the legs a bit, separating the casts on the arms and legs into bandages for a more overall complete design. The head also needed to be shifted up a bit, but otherwise this design was more or less complete the first time around. Egolephus, the tree burrow Pokemon. Yeesh, that face needs some Botox to fix those eye bags. Had to cut those ASAP. I need to shrink the torso by a hair as well as giving it some smaller leaves/feathers on the tail for more contrast. The eyes are also a bit big for this face. Honestly, I still don't really care for this Pokemon in either version. It's just there, if I'm being honest. Podarborus, the bark body Pokemon. The eyes and chest bark were a bit too complicated in this pass of the design, so I needed to definitely simplify them in the reboot. I also should have changed the eye color. The yellow does not look good here. The wings are easily the worst part of this design by a country mile. Needed to completely redesign them so they actually look stable. The tips of the root feet also don't work. I should have made them the same shade of green as the head for some color balancing. And lastly, the tail feathers needed to be spread out a bit more. They're a little too clustered together. Cobradar, the signal snake Pokemon. This guy was actually almost perfect from the beginning, if not for two minor things. Firstly, the hood's off. It needed to be further into the body, and the line work it's just bad. Secondly, the antenna on the chest should have been turned into the tongue, creating a more streamlined body. I did those in the reboot, and it really, really helped cement this design as one of my favorites from the region. Koopapeel, the false fruit Pokemon. This line sucks. There's no beating around the bush here. The concept is fun, but the execution is actually awful on every level. The legs look terrible, the head is a bit too small, the torso isn't interesting, and the render is just abysmal. This was one of the first lines I created for the region, if I recall correctly, which is why it looks like ass. I also hate the shining. I actually hate everything about this design. Otasifang, the bunch spider Pokemon. Blah. Everything about this sucks ass. The body is way too busy with the bruises and the aged banana spots. The legs look terrible again. The head and eyes are too small, hard to get a grasp of that with a mere glance. Overall, this fails on every level. I had to do some serious redesigns for these 2 years later. Orcold, the Ice Pup Pokemon. This one is actually more or less between the two versions the same, outside of a minor pose and some perspective changes. The body needed to be a bit more streamlined with the lower jaw, so I forced the tail and the perspective to shift a little bit to better accommodate that. I needed to move the diamond blowhole up on the forehead and the diamond mark on the side further towards the back of the torso. Still a good Pokemon design at this stage, but not great. Orclacier, the Shadow Whale Pokemon. Legit, the only difference between the two versions of this Pokemon is that the reboot has better line work. That's it. Everything else was the exact same with this Pokemon. It didn't need to change. I actually hit pay dirt with this design the first time around. I'm a little happy with myself there. I don't get many W's with this version of the region. Or Faenun, the Faith Pokemon. The biggest fault of this design is just not clearly separating the colors better with the line work, also some minor color balancing issues. Otherwise, the design's actually pretty damn good, in my opinion. I didn't need to change much about this design as a whole. Hydruffle, the Mold Dragon Pokemon. Our Noodle Dragon boy here has a big issue, but apparently that one is debatable amongst some of my audience. Some people like the more complicated feat of the original here. I am not one of those people, but I respect it for those who do enjoy that for whatever reason that is beyond my capability of understanding. Other than getting rid of the feet, the design needed brighter colors for the heads, and just overall bigger horn/antenna. The design is also a bit muted saturation-wise. Had to fix that. Octokoko, the Coconut Shell Pokemon. Bigger eyes and a darker blue and green for the color palette, and this design would have been perfect from the very beginning. This is one of my favorite Pokemon to this day, and I may or may not have given it some love in my current ongoing region. You'll see that down the line on the channel. I don't know when, but you'll see it. Stomata Punch, the Impact Pokemon. This one doesn't suck, but oh boy is it underwhelming. The color scheme and palette don't go far enough with the Mantis Shrimp's overall weirdness. Same for this Pokemon's unique eyes. They're not showcased enough, in my opinion. I needed to flip the tail in the opposite direction to show off more of the Pokemon's body. The mustache is too thin, and the tail is too barren design-wise. Some minor proportion changes, and this Pokemon would have been good. Thankfully, the reboot design is a lot better than this. Sydine Apom, the long-tail Pokemon. The only major issues this design needs to fix are the arms and the shape of the feet/flippers. The feet should have been modeled more after scuba flippers to go along with the rest of the theming of the line better, and the arms needed to be pointed down and turned into something closer to seal flippers or fish fins. The fin on top of their head that doubles as hair could have been done better as well. Sydine Ambipom, the long-tail Pokemon. The only major thing needed to change with this design are the tail/extra arms in the back. The shape of the fingers don't work for an aquatic creature, so I needed to sharpen them to tear through the water easier. The feet could also use a bit of an update as well, and extending the gray on the torso into the arms to better resemble a wetsuit could have gone a long way in the first draft of this design. But granted, this entire video is hindsight. Mineon, the Cave Digger Pokemon. Hello, Discount Umbreon. Been a while. Yeah, this design is way too similar to other evolutions without a proper identity for itself. The gray isn't good enough color-wise to anchor the design, so I needed to replace with a blue to cement everything else around it. The gold needed to be more sparing and purposeful as an accent color. I needed to make the tail smaller but more stable to support the drill at the end. Also, I needed to have the gold cover the entire ear, as well as change said shape of the ear for some more visual identity. Lastly, the legs needed more definition to them and variation since the silhouette is dull as hell. This wasn't my best foot forward in the evolution department. Oh yeah, this was my first evolution, if I didn't make that clear enough. Nimbion, the Cloud Fox Pokemon. This one fared better, but not by much. The wing/cloud membrane doesn't look good here, so I needed to change that to something more stable to support flight. The bat ear wings are cute, but they don't mesh with the rest of the design well, despite the flying fox inspiration. The gray needed to be more of an accent color, and the pose here, while it's dynamic, it doesn't show off enough the design in my opinion, so that had to change. This isn't bad, but it's not good either. Terrapin, the Lancebeak Pokemon. The first fossil of the region, this little guy's head needed to be shaped more like an ancient spear or arrowhead to tie in with the overall theme of the line better. The perspective on the head is way off, and the color balancing is just balls. I added black in the reboot to better anchor the rest of the colors together. The wings are also a bit too small for the body, so they needed to be wider in general. Terrascure, the Spearbeak Pokemon. The tip of the beak looks too weak in this version, so I bulked that up and changed the teeth in that section so it felt more solid in the reboot. The overall silhouette is a smidge lacking, so this thing needed more of a neck in general, so it didn't feel as crowded. The wings needed a bit more color to the membrane outside the small spot at the very end, so I needed to expand on that massively. This was actually a pretty good first attempt at the design and a decent first fossil mon in general in my catalog. Varonim, the Toxic Bite Pokemon. The second fossil of the region looks like shit. The legs are fucking toothpicks that won't support this thing's weight at all, and they just look terrible in general. The torso is too long, too skinny. This thing needed some serious chunk on it. The rest is passable, but it really benefited from the rebooted design. Venolania, the Venom Lord Pokemon. This one was actually almost perfect from jump. Only a few minor things holding this toxic fella back. The color scheme is too dark overall without enough contrast. The main skin color needed to be a lighter gray to make the rest of the color scheme stand out. The orange pattern is a bit too busy, and the claws should have just been solid purple for simplicity. Like its pre-evolution, the torso is a tad too long and skinny, but is not nearly as bad, thankfully. This was actually a really good design even back then. Piorora, the Light Spectrum Pokemon. One of the few mythicals in my catalog, and this looks terrible. The tail and headpiece are the worst design choices here, without a doubt. The tail doesn't have enough transition between each color to feel natural, and the headpiece just looks terrible. There also isn't enough purple in design as a whole, and it's just bare bones accent-wise. This took a lot of effort to fix in the reboot. Harlequin, the clown rabbit Pokemon. The biggest issues are the eyes with this design. They're soulless and creepy. The ears are too long and they needed to be reined in a bit more. Lastly, the shades of blue and red aren't striking enough, and as a result, they don't really stand out that much. The crimson puffballs around the neck and at the tip of the ears don't add anything to the design, and we're better off being white for color consistency, something I fixed down the line. Bunnight, the iron ear Pokemon. The face is boring and too small for the head, mainly with the eyes, and the ear shield needed to be flushed together to create a more effective design for what I wanted it to be. The arms are too small for this build, and the overall proportions just suck. The color scheme isn't much better. Oh boy, this took so much effort to fix, I don't even know where to begin. But not as much as the final evolution. Legendaries, the rabbit monarch Pokemon. Easily the worst design of the line by a landslide. The face has little rhyme or reason to the color placement, and it just looks too chaotic. There's too much gold in the design, and it needed another color to help balance out the essential three outside of the white fur cape. The staff is completely unnecessary and looks out of place on a Pokemon. Another Pokemon that really benefited from the reboot. Uranmare, the Oasis Dragon Pokemon. Out of all the over-designing complaints I've had so far in this region, the Legendaries take it to a whole new level of suck. I needed to scrap the majority of the patterns on the body as well as the colors. I took the Rainbow Serpent concept too literally and had way too many colors in this palette. The render on the water wings are awful. The fins across the body needed to be simplified so they felt a lot more organic to the design. I learned a lot from these Pokemon after the fact on what not to do. Stononadira, the continent lizard Pokemon. The final Pokemon of the region, and this is just as bad as Uranmare in terms of over-designing. Eliminate all these small dots across the design. They clutter it too much and they add nothing in return. I need to condense the colors massively until a unified pattern is born. Lastly, the render on the energy segments is terrible and needed to be redone. While this is just as busy as its counterpart color-wise and detail-wise, I didn't actually have to change as much of the body comparatively, thankfully. Ugh, finally done. I won't lie, going back and looking over this region was painful for me. I can't believe I thought most of these designs were acceptable, let alone good. But the region reboots really helped me iron out the near endless kinks these designs had. Regardless, I hope you had fun listening to me rip this region apart. Thought this would be a fun way to end off the year. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed today's video. I got a playlist with more if you want to keep this train going. When we return in January, we will be going over what I consider to be my best fakemon region thus far, the Athnos region. Though, we're going to be mixing up the format with that one. Stay tuned. This is Austin, signing out, and have a happy new year, early from me.